Picture this. The year is 2020, a world already unsettled by silence, isolation, and fear. Offices turned into bedrooms, conference tables replaced by flickering screens, and human connection filtered through tiny boxes of pixels. For millions, the new reality was endless video calls, mundane updates delivered in monotone voices, numbers, graphs, muted microphones. But for one man, on one morning, a routine meeting became the key to unlocking a mystery buried for 25 long years. It began as ordinary as any Tuesday could be. The sunlight cut across his desk, stripes of gold and shadow falling on papers that meant little in the grand scope of history. His laptop hummed quietly, camera light flickered, the screen waiting for faces to appear. But when it did, when the rows of names aligned and voices echoed in virtual unison, his eyes locked on a face that seemed to freeze time. A face he recognized, though he could not believe it. A face that should have been impossible to see. For a split second, memory collided with present reality. The tired features of a 30-something employee overlapped with the innocent image of a boy printed on milk cartons in the mid-90s. A boy who had vanished without a trace, swallowed by shadows, leaving only questions and grief. That boy's name had once been spoken in every neighborhood, carried in whispers on school playgrounds, taped to post office walls, etched into the hearts of a family that refused to let go. Yet here he was, alive, breathing, unaware. The meeting continued. Voices droned on, but the boss could not hear numbers, could not see charts. He saw instead the details from long ago, the freckled cheeks, the missing tooth, the faint scar that cut above the eyebrow. They were the same. Age had stretched the child into a man, but the marks of identity remained like ghosts that refused to fade. He sat there paralyzed, the weight of recognition pressing down like a storm. Could it truly be him? Or had grief and memory played a cruel trick? The world outside was suffocating in lockdown, yet inside that video call, a crack opened between past and present, pulling together decades of silence and one extraordinary moment of revelation. The boss, Marcus, could no longer ignore it. What began as a simple quarterly review was transforming into the unraveling of a quarter-century-old secret. His breath slowed, his palms dampened, and in that moment everything changed. For 25 years, the story had been told in fragments. A boy vanishes on an ordinary school day, his last note left on the refrigerator, his toy discovered abandoned. In an alley, volunteers comb fields, police question neighbors, leads grow cold. Decades pass, hope fades, and the family carries on, shattered yet bound by the void of not knowing. That absence had become their prison. But now, staring at his screen, Marcus realized he might be seeing the impossible answer. What he saw was not a ghost, not a shadow, not a distorted memory. It was a living man speaking about sales projections, his voice calm, his posture stiff, his eyes avoiding the camera with the same shy unease teachers had once described of the missing child. Marcus knew what he was witnessing was either madness or truth. He reached instinctively for his keyboard, fingers hovering, unsure whether to capture the image or close the laptop and pretend nothing had happened. The decision itself felt dangerous, as though pressing the wrong key might destroy lives. He glanced again, the scar, the eyes, the birthmark half hidden under the faint stubble. Each detail piled upon the next until denial crumbled. He whispered aloud, though no one could hear him. It's him. In that instant, the past came flooding back. June 1995, a day forever scorched into memory. The posters, the candlelight, vigils, the endless news segments. A boy's face haunting grocery aisles and community boards, the whispered rumors of vans seen idling near schools. the heartbreak etched into his parents' faces every time the cameras turned toward them. All of it had lived as unsolved history. And now here it was, staring directly at him through a webcam in the middle of a pandemic. The rest of the meeting blurred. Numbers meant nothing. Colleagues asked questions, voices echoed through speakers, but Marcus remained trapped in the collision of past and present. He scribbled notes, not about revenue, but about the angles of a jawline, the slight slump of shoulders, the timbre of a voice that sounded too familiar. Each second confirmed what his gut already screamed. The missing child had not died. He had lived, he had grown. He had been hidden. And now, through the chance of a global crisis and the lens of a video call, the truth had slipped into view. Picture him after the meeting, hands hovering above the keyboard as if touching a live wire. The cursor blinked, patient and merciless. He could end it with one click, shut the laptop, erase the moment, pretend nothing had happened. Or he could step into the corridor between two eras and follow where memory led. He chose the corridor. He pressed screenshot. Once, twice, 17 times as the face shifted, as the light crossed, as the unguarded angles appeared and vanished like signals in fog. He opened a folder and named it with shaking pragmatism. Archive. Inside, faces paused mid-sentence, stared back, the same brow, the same crescent above the right eye. The years had done their sculpting, but the old outline still thrummed beneath. He leaned closer until his breath fogged the glass. A stubble shadow deepened. The birthmark lived there, faint, undeniable. He felt the past uncoil. Back on the desktop, another window woke. A social page, grey with age-progressed images someone had kept updating out of stubborn hope. He scrolled. There it was, the computer's guess of a grown face built from the last school portrait. Not proof, but a compass. He toggled between the guess and the captured frames from the meeting, letting them flicker like a handmade flipbook. Chin, eyes, scar. He could feel the alignment click into place, a quiet lock engaging inside his chest. Outside his window, the neighborhood held its breath. The hum of distant sirens, the wind's thin thread through empty branches, the muffled thud of someone dropping groceries at a door and retreating. Inside, the room smelled of stale coffee and printer heat. His pulse counted seconds, the wall clock forgot to. He typed the name he had not allowed himself to say in years. Letters came slowly, as if the keyboard were a ritual instrument. The page that answered felt like opening an attic trunk. Old articles, old pleas, an old phone number that likely rang into a void. He read anyway. The boy had loved space books and read yo-yos. He had planted sunflowers. He had asked for one more chapter before bed. These were small things, but they were the kind that survived the collapse of time. He closed his eyes, and for a breath, the two faces overlapped completely. Past and present soldered. He was not a detective, not a savior. He was the first witness to a window that technology had cracked open. His finger hovered over a call icon he had no right to press. Instead, he copied links, saved photos, opened a blank document, and wrote what memory still held. Dates, sidewalks, a rumor about a van, the taste of summer air turning metallic when sirens began. He looked again at the captured face. The man in the meeting had spoken about churn models and regional metrics in a careful cadence that felt practiced, like someone stepping across a creek on stones memorized long ago. Avoid the camera, keep the head angled, smile without teeth, stay small, survive. The performance was itself a map. Every dodge suggested a border. Marcus followed the borders until they formed a shape he knew too well. He opened the company directory. There was a thin biography, schools, dates, a city that appeared after the year the boy had vanished. No childhood listed, no hometown. A clean beginning that started where another life had ended. The omission glared like neon. He whispered the title his mind had chosen for what this was becoming, a phrase that promised to rupture the sealed jar of time. During a Zoom meeting, a boss recognizes an employee as a child who disappeared in 1995. Not a headline yet, not an accusation, a possibility heavy enough to bend the table. He stood, paced, sat again. The chair creaked like an old door. He remembered a candlelight vigil where the air smelled of wax and wet grass, remembered a stranger pressing a pamphlet into his hands, remembered the grain of the wooden church pew where, for the first time, he understood that silence can be loud enough to bruise. All those sounds rose now, braided with the click of keys and the faint high buzz of the laptop fan. He told himself to breathe, to wait, to confirm. But waiting felt like a kind of harm. He opened an email, addressed it to himself, and attached. The screenshots were the subject line that felt almost superstitious: keep safe. Then he closed his eyes as if to reset the world. When he opened them, the face was still there on the paused frame, a man frozen mid-explanation, mouth half open, the past leaning through that small square of glass. What would he do next? The question hovered like a moth circling a lamp. He knew that whatever path he chose, it would drag the brittle threads of many lives into light. He knew that once voiced, such knowledge does not return to quiet. The door between eras had opened, and the hinge would not hold. Tomorrow would not be like yesterday. After the truth, nothing would be the same. He felt the room tilt, present bending toward the past. Night fell that same day, though Marcus hardly noticed when shadows replaced sunlight in the corners of his study. The meeting had ended hours before, yet its echo refused to release him. He sat in the hush of his home, the screen still open, the captured images like silent witnesses staring from the folder. Each photograph carried the weight of decades, each pixel humming with the electricity of recognition. The world outside was quiet, neighbors sealed indoors by the invisible threat of the pandemic, streets emptied to a stillness that felt almost post-apocalyptic. In that silence, the past spoke louder. He turned to memory, as though replaying an old tape. The boy's name, once spoken on the evening news, printed on missing posters, repeated in classrooms until it became an ache in every sentence, rose again. The boy had disappeared on a warm June afternoon, a day so ordinary it mocked the tragedy that followed. He remembered candle vigils glowing like constellations on suburban lawns, remembered mothers clutching their children tighter, fathers pacing driveways as though vigilance could barricade them from loss. Everyone had lived in fear then, waiting for sirens or headlines, and through it all, the face of the missing child endured. Grainy photographs taped to milk cartons and grocery store windows, a reminder of innocence severed. Marcus leaned forward, elbows on knees, staring at the man on his screen. It wasn't only resemblance, it was rhythm. The way the man hesitated before speaking, the way he held his shoulders tight as though braced for impact. These were not just traits of adulthood. They were echoes of a boy who had once preferred reading during recess to playing football, who had been shy with strangers, but steady with friends. Marcus could almost hear the laughter that had vanished, feel the chill of the unanswered question. Where had he gone? The screenshots were not proof, not yet. But truth often begins as a whisper before it grows into thunder. And this whisper carried a certainty that made his chest ache. He felt both terror and responsibility. If he ignored it, he might be burying the chance to heal an open wound that had bled across decades. If he acted rashly, he could shatter a life rebuilt under fragile circumstances. He pushed back from the desk, pacing. The wooden floor groaned under his weight. The air smelled faintly of dust and brewed coffee gone cold. He thought of the boy's parents, faceless in his memory, yet carved by grief into living statues. He thought of the thousands of hours volunteers had spent searching fields, woods, alleys, always returning empty-handed. He thought of the child's bedroom, imagined untouched for years, a shrine of toys and clothes waiting for a return that never came. The idea that the boy might have survived, grown, worked quietly under a new name, this idea was both miraculous and unbearable. He closed his eyes, summoning the last vigil he'd attended as a teenager. A priest had spoken softly, his words trembling with doubt. "Hope is a lantern," he had said. "Sometimes it burns quietly, barely a flicker, but it is still flame." Marcus felt that flame surge now, searing his throat, making it impossible to swallow the possibility staring him in the face. The room felt smaller, walls pressing in. He returned to the screen, enlarging the photo until the pixels blurred. There, in the grain of digital distortion, he saw the same gap-toothed smile, only time had filled the tooth. He saw the scar, like a signature. He saw the eyes, not identical to memory, but shaped by it, eyes that had learned to hide. In the middle of isolation, while the world battled an invisible virus, Marcus confronted a different contagion, the persistence of truth. Some things refuse to vanish, no matter how. Long buried, technology, chance, and one unguarded moment had peeled back a layer of reality, revealing the impossible. He whispered again, softer this time, almost a prayer. "It's him." He knew the revelation was not the end. It was the beginning. The next steps would demand courage he wasn't sure he had, but one certainty pressed against his chest: this was not coincidence. This was discovery. The thread of a story that had unraveled in 1995 had reappeared, dangling in front of him across 25 years of silence. And once you see a thread like that, you cannot look away. You pull, you follow, and you learn what lies at the other end. The night deepened. The city outside seemed to vanish into stillness, while in Marcus's study, the weight of history grew. What had been a simple Tuesday morning had transformed into the prelude of something vast and haunting. He felt it in his bones. Tomorrow, lives would change. Secrets long hidden would surface, and the name of the boy lost in 1995 would no longer belong to silence. His name was Ethan Cole. He was 9 years and 4 months old when he vanished, a boy caught between the glow of childhood wonder and the restless pull of curiosity. Ethan had hair the color of sunlit chestnut, a mess of strands that refused to stay combed, no matter how carefully his mother tried. His eyes were a clear hazel, flecked with amber, the kind of eyes that shifted from green to gold, depending on the light. He carried a crescent-shaped scar just above his left eyebrow, the result of a tumble from his blue BMX bike when he was 7. And on his right forearm, faint but visible if you looked closely, a birthmark shaped like a teardrop. On the morning of his disappearance, Ethan wore a striped t-shirt in blue and white, his favorite because it reminded him of the astronaut. Uniforms he admired in library books. Over that, he had a faded denim jacket with a missing button and shorts torn at the knees from countless afternoons of playground adventures. His sneakers were red, with soles that lit up when he ran. Though the left shoe flickered only half the time, something he insisted made them special. In his backpack, he carried 2 essentials: a worn paperback of The Hobbit, a gift from his father, and his collection of trading cards wrapped carefully in rubber bands. Ethan was not just another child lost to statistics. He was vibrant, restless, filled with an imagination that seemed too large for the small Midwestern town where he lived. His dream was simple yet enormous. He wanted to touch the stars. Every night, he pressed glow-in-the-dark constellations onto his ceiling, arranging them exactly as he saw in books. He told his mother almost nightly, "One day, I'll leave Earth and wave back at you from the moon." He was the boy who preferred building paper rockets to watching cartoons, who lined his baseball cards as if they were satellites orbiting a planet. Yet for all his brilliance, he was shy, especially in crowds. Teachers described him as polite, thoughtful, but often lost in daydreams. He was the kind of child who bit his nails when nervous, who lowered his gaze when strangers spoke, who sought comfort in routine. His best friend Tommy lived just 3 houses down, and together they invented elaborate games, astronauts on missions, detectives solving imaginary crimes, superheroes defending their street corner from invisible villains. Ethan often took the role of the thinker, drawing maps, keeping score, narrating adventures with surprising gravitas for his age. The Cole family was modest but warm. His father, Daniel, worked double shifts at the local auto plant, returning home with grease-stained hands and weary shoulders. His mother, Laura, taught 3rd grade at the elementary school Ethan attended. She carried the gentle patience of a teacher, though grief had left faint shadows in her eyes. 3 years earlier, they had lost Ethan's younger sister, Emily, to pneumonia. That loss turned Ethan into the center of their universe, their last child, their reason to wake each morning, despite the weight of sorrow pressing against their lives. The house they lived in stood on Maplewood Lane, a 2-story structure with peeling white paint and a yard where Ethan had planted sunflower seeds. The previous summer, his room, painted sky blue, carried the smell of books and crayons. On his nightstand sat a battered alarm clock shaped like Mickey Mouse, its bells chipped but still reliable, ringing every school morning at precisely 6:30. Posters of planets and rockets covered his walls, while action figures, superheroes, astronauts, ninjas stood guard on the dresser. His desk was cluttered with notebooks filled with sketches of solar systems and spaceships, alongside math worksheets marked with neat handwriting, small details of home made Ethan who he was. The sound of his mother's old radio in the kitchen playing soft country songs while she packed his lunch. The smell of bacon mixed with the sweetness of orange juice that greeted him most mornings. The way his father's footsteps on the stairs announced the rare mornings he wasn't working overtime. And Ethan's own ritual, slipping his lucky red yo-yo into his pocket before leaving for school, convinced it brought him courage in difficult moments. That morning, June 13th, 1995, began like any other. At 6:30, the Mickey Mouse alarm rang, a shrill reminder that the day had begun. By 6:35, his mother opened the door, finding him already sitting up, rubbing his eyes, hair sticking in every direction. He showered for exactly 7 minutes, singing, quietly under his breath, a habit of humming the theme from Star Wars. At 6:50, he padded downstairs barefoot, greeted by the smell of pancakes and syrup. He ate quickly, pouring extra syrup when his mother looked away, washing it down with cold milk. By 7:15, his father kissed him on the head and ruffled his hair before heading to work with his lunchbox in hand. At 7:30, Ethan laced his sneakers, double-knotting the laces like his father had taught him. His mother called from the kitchen, reminding him not to forget the science project he had worked on for weeks, a solar system diorama built from painted styrofoam balls suspended by string. He promised she could bring it later, waving with a gap-toothed grin. At 7:40, they climbed into her beige Honda Civic. The streets were already alive with the metallic hum of a paperboy's bicycle and the faint fragrance of lilacs blooming in the neighbor's yard. By 7:55, they reached Willow Creek Elementary. Ethan climbed out with his backpack slung across one shoulder, his yo-yo string wrapped around his finger. He turned back to wave, the morning sun catching the birthmark on his arm, then sprinted toward the entrance. His mother watched him disappear through the doors, unaware that this was the last ordinary moment she would ever see her son as Ethan Cole. At school, Ethan followed the rituals of a 4th grader's day, moments so ordinary that no one could have imagined they were the last of their kind. At 8:05, he joined his class in the homeroom, dropping into his desk with the familiar creak of wood against the floor. He greeted his teacher, Mrs. Patterson, with a shy nod, pulling out his pencil and the small notebook where he kept both his spelling words and secret sketches of rockets. She smiled, reminding him of the science project, and he promised, again, that his mother would bring it at recess. At 8:30, the class began math drills. Ethan wrote carefully, numbers forming with deliberate precision. He raised his hand only once to confirm an answer. 7 multiplied by 8 equals 56. Mrs. Patterson praised his focus, and his cheeks flushed with the glow of recognition. At 9:15 came reading time, his favorite part of the morning. While others whispered or doodled, Ethan immersed himself in The Hobbit, tracing each sentence with his finger, lips moving as if he were whispering to the page. When the bell rang at 10:30 for recess, he lingered an extra few seconds before slipping the book into his bag, reluctant to let the story rest. The playground was alive with clattering voices, sneakers pounding across asphalt, and the sharp squeak of swings cutting through the air. Ethan found Tommy, his best friend, by the rusted seesaws. They played marbles on the dusty ground, Ethan's red shooter marble flashing in the sun. Laughter rose and fell, broken only by Ethan's sudden glance toward the entrance of the yard. He thought he saw a man waiting beyond the fence, but dismissed it quickly. Just a passerby, perhaps. At 10:47, a photograph was taken by the school's photography club, capturing a chess group in the foreground. In the blurry background, Ethan's smile flickered, yo-yo in hand, the last photograph ever recorded of him as a child. Lunch followed at 12:15. Ethan unwrapped the peanut butter and jelly sandwich his mother had packed, biting into it while trading half his apple with Tommy for a cookie. He drank grape juice from a small box, his straw bent awkwardly from careless fingers. He laughed at Jeremy, another boy at the table, who made faces while chewing carrots. It was such an ordinary lunch, so profoundly uneventful that its memory later would feel cruel. How could the world have seemed so steady, so safe, when disaster was already drawing near? By 1 p.m., Ethan returned to class, participating in history lessons, tracing maps with his ruler, though his gaze often drifted to the window where clouds marched across a pale sky. At 2:30, Mrs. Patterson handed back homework assignments, and Ethan stuffed his paper carelessly into his bag, eager for the bell. He whispered to Tommy that they would walk together after school, stop at Tommy's house for a snack before heading home. Tommy agreed. They planned nothing extraordinary, just another afternoon of games and jokes. At 2:47, the dismissal bell rang. Students surged through hallways, backpacks bouncing, voices echoing. Ethan was seen on the grainy school security camera at 2:51, heading toward the east exit. At 2:52, another figure appeared in the same frame, blurred and indistinct. By 2:53, both were gone, swallowed by the corner of the building where the camera's eye failed to reach. At home, time moved differently. At 3:05, Tommy waited on his porch, glancing down the street for Ethan. Minutes stretched. By 3:30, he assumed plans had changed. By 3:45, he had wandered inside. At 4 Dow, Ethan's mother Laura expected her son at the door. By 4:15, unease prickled her chest. At 4:30, she stood by the window watching the street grow long with shadows. The Cole household, usually warmed by the smell of dinner beginning to simmer and the faint hum of a radio, shifted into silence. Laura searched each room as if Ethan might be hiding behind curtains, under the bed, in the closet. She found only his absence and the half-finished diorama of planets resting on the kitchen table, styrofoam spheres suspended in frozen orbits. By 4:40, she was outside, calling his name down Maplewood Lane, her voice carried on the wind, unanswered. At 5:02, she phoned Tommy's house, and his mother's calm reply shattered the fragile balance. Ethan had never arrived. Panic set in like ice. By 5:10, she was dialing Daniel at the auto plant, her voice breaking, "Something's wrong." He left immediately, hands trembling as he drove home, headlights cutting through the early dusk. By 5:30, the neighborhood was alive with calls, neighbors stepping onto porches, faces lined with concern. At 5:43, Officer Mitchell arrived, his notepad ready, his eyes already tight with worry. The first questions were simple: last time seen, what he wore, where he might have gone. Laura answered in broken fragments. Daniel clenched his fists, staring. Down the street, as though sheer willpower could summon his son from the shadows, what had begun as a day painted with routine had collapsed into chaos. The boy who dreamed of the stars had stepped into the unknown, and the world around him would never again feel safe. By the time the sun dipped beneath the rooftops of Maplewood Lane, the Cole family's world had been torn open. Yet to understand the depth of that rupture, one must look closer at the intimate fabric of their lives, the ordinary rituals that had once formed their safety net. Ethan's disappearance was not just the loss of a child, it was the unraveling of a household already scarred by grief and the extinguishing of the fragile hope that had kept them moving forward. Laura Cole was the anchor of that family, though. She carried a sorrow no anchor should. She had been a teacher for nearly a decade, and her students adored her patience, her gentle way of explaining fractions or spelling words. But behind her smile lay the memory of Emily, the daughter she had lost years before to pneumonia. Emily had been 5, full of light and mischief, and her sudden death left Laura moving through life as though half her heart had been buried with her. Ethan's laughter, his curiosity, his warmth, these became the stitches that held her together. Losing him was unimaginable, and yet, on that June afternoon, it became her reality. Daniel Cole, Ethan's father, was a man molded by routine. The auto plant demanded long hours, and his hands bore the calluses of endless labor. But no matter how weary he returned each evening, he found strength in the simple joy of ruffling his son's hair, in the small promises of fishing trips or backyard baseball. He had grown up believing that hard work built walls against chaos. When Ethan vanished, those walls crumbled in a single hour. To watch his wife's face collapse into panic was to feel his own foundation fracture, leaving him powerless in a way no broken machine at the plant ever could. Ethan's bedroom embodied who he was. The walls painted blue, the glow in the dark, stars carefully placed on the ceiling, the model rockets balanced on his dresser, each one a small dream pointed upward. On his desk, math worksheets were scattered alongside sketches of spaceships and planets, his handwriting neat but slanted, eager to run ahead of itself. His closet smelled faintly of detergent and crayons, his sneakers lined up in uneven pairs, one shoe always missing a lace. It was a room alive with the echoes of a boy who believed the world was vast, who believed adventure waited just beyond the horizon. Small rituals defined the Cole household. Breakfast each morning was accompanied by the hum of an old radio in the kitchen, usually tuned to soft country songs or the static buzz of local news. Laura always placed a folded napkin in Ethan's lunchbox with a tiny doodle drawn in marker. A smiley face, a star, sometimes a rocket ship with the words "Fly High." Ethan would grin when he found them, showing Tommy at lunch, proud as though his mother's doodles were treasures. Dinner was simpler. Macaroni and cheese, roasted chicken, or spaghetti with garlic bread, meals that filled the house with sense of comfort. These details, so mundane at the time, later became sacred fragments of memory. On weekends, the family tried to hold on to joy despite their grief for Emily. They visited Lake Haven, where Ethan practiced skipping stones and begged his father to let him row the boat. Sundays were slower, filled with pancakes and church service, Ethan tugging at his too stiff shirt collar. The family had no riches, but their wealth was in these routines, in the steady rhythm of days that felt secure. And that is why the rupture of June 13th was unbearable. When Ethan failed to return, every ritual turned into an echo. The smell of pancakes became a reminder of absence. The doodles left behind on napkins became relics. His blue room turned into a shrine that no one dared disturb. Neighbors remembered Ethan as the boy who waved at everyone, shy but unfailingly polite. He watered his sunflowers with devotion, often crouching to talk to them as though they could hear. He carried his red yo-yo everywhere, practicing tricks while walking, the snap of the string against his palm, a familiar sound on the block. He was the kind of child people assumed would be safe because he radiated goodness, because no one wanted to imagine harm reaching him. That innocence made the wound all the deeper when he vanished. The final minutes of his known life replayed endlessly. In his parents' minds, the wave at the school door, the promise about the science project, the smile with the gap-toothed grin. Those were the images they clung to, etched sharper with each year that followed. They did not know yet that their son's face would one day reappear in the unlikeliest of places, on a screen during a pandemic, years after hope had faded. For now, all they knew was the hollow ache of waiting, the gnawing silence of a chair left empty at dinner. What had been ordinary became unthinkable. What had been routine became tragedy. And for Laura and Daniel Cole, the disappearance of their only surviving child was not just the loss of a boy. It was the theft of their world, the dismantling of the fragile structure that had carried them through grief once before. This time, the weight was heavier, the silence louder, and the hope more desperate. June 13th, 1995. The day carried the kind of brightness that made everything feel deceptively safe. The temperature hovered at 78 degrees, the air thick with the fragrance of lilacs spilling over from Mrs. Henderson's garden. School. Buses hissed as they released their brakes, their yellow frames gleaming under a cloudless sky. The metallic sound of a paperboy's bicycle drifted in from a nearby street, a rhythm that blended with the laughter of children racing toward freedom at the sound of the dismissal bell. It was the kind of afternoon where nothing evil seemed possible, and perhaps that was the cruelest detail of all. At 2:47 p.m., the bell rang inside Willow Creek Elementary. Backpacks swung onto small shoulders, sneakers squeaked against linoleum, and the hallways filled with a flood of chatter. Ethan Cole moved with the tide of students, his striped t-shirt and red sneakers a blur among dozens of others. He clutched his backpack loosely, his yo-yo wound tight around two fingers, as though even in the rush of dismissal he needed its familiar weight. At 2:51, the analog security camera above the east exit recorded him stepping into sunlight. Shoes tape, later reviewed again and again until the film itself wore thin, showed Ethan pausing briefly to adjust his backpack. Behind him, children spilled outward in clusters, shouting goodbyes, waving at teachers. He glanced once toward the playground, then began walking alone toward the side gate, where he usually cut through to meet Tommy. At 2:52, another figure entered the camera's frame. The image was grainy, blurred by the limits of 1990s surveillance technology. A tall adult, indistinct in features, stood at the edge of the view. Ethan turned his head toward the figure. His face lit briefly in what could have been recognition, or simply the reflex of a polite child acknowledging an adult. At 2:53, both figures slipped out of the frame. That was the last recorded image of Ethan Cole. By 3:05, Tommy Peterson sat, waiting on his porch, watching for his friend. He later told investigators that he assumed Ethan had gone back for his science project or had been delayed by a teacher. By 3:20, he grew restless, bouncing a ball against the steps. At 3:45, with no sign of Ethan, he shrugged and went inside, never imagining that his friend's absence marked the beginning of a nightmare. Other witnesses added fragments to the story. Margaret Cooper, 67 years old, lived 2 blocks from the school. At 3:15, she noticed a dark van idling near the corner of Oak Street and 3rd Avenue. The driver, she recalled, wore a red baseball cap, his gaze fixed on the school's direction. She remembered frowning at the sight, muttering to herself that the vehicle didn't belong to anyone on their block. When asked later, she admitted she thought about writing down the license plate but dismissed the idea. A different account came from Harold Finch, a retired postal worker and avid bird watcher. At 2:54 in his handwritten journal, he described watching a boy with a backpack climb voluntarily into a dark vehicle. Driver offered something. Looked like candy or toy, his entry read. Boy smiled, stepped inside. Vehicle turned east. Finch, unaware of the significance, tucked his journal away. He wouldn't connect the moment to Ethan until days later, when the missing flyers appeared. The first physical clue appeared hours afterward. At 6:22 p.m., a homeless man known as Carl Red Thompson found a red yo-yo abandoned in an alley behind Murphy's liquor store, 3 blocks from the school. He pocketed it absent-mindedly, only realizing its importance when he saw the word yo-yo listed on a flyer 2 days later. By then, crucial hours had already been lost. The atmosphere of that day is etched into memory not only through testimony, but through sensation. The warmth of the afternoon clung to the skin. The smell of gasoline lingered near the curb where buses idled, mingling with the sweet aroma of lilacs. The shrill calls of starlings rose above the hum of engines, and the crackle of gravel under hurried shoes created a soundtrack of ordinary departure. But beneath those sounds was an undertone, invisible at the time, that only hindsight would reveal. The sound of an ending. By late afternoon, the first signs of panic had begun at the Cole household. At 4 egg, Laura expected Ethan to appear, dropping his backpack near the stairs and asking for a snack. At 4:10, she set a plate of cookies on the counter, half distracted, humming along to the radio. At 4:20, the house was still silent. By 4:30, her chest tightened, a mother's intuition sparking alarm. She stepped onto the porch, scanning the street, calling his name once, then again. Neighbors trimming hedges or watering lawns looked up, their smiles fading as they read the urgency in her face. At 4:37, she dialed her husband, her voice breaking. "Something's wrong." Daniel left the auto plant immediately, his lunchbox abandoned in the break room, his hands shaking on the steering wheel as he raced home. By 5:15, after circling the streets with no success, the Coles made the call they had dreaded, 911. The call to 911 marked the shift from unease to full alarm. At 5:43 p.m., Officer Dennis Mitchell pulled up to Maplewood Lane in a cruiser that seemed too small for the gravity it carried. He stepped out with a notepad already in hand, his uniform pressed but his expression tight. He listened as Laura described the last moment she had seen Ethan, the wave at the school entrance, the promise about the science project, the red sneakers flashing as he ran inside. Her voice cracked under the weight of memory, her hands twisting in the hem of her blouse. Daniel, his face pale, repeated the time he left the auto plant, how his son had not been home when he arrived. Neighbors began to gather, pulled by the scent of panic. Porch lights flicked on, though the sky was still dusky blue. A few offered reassurances. Maybe Ethan was at a friend's house. Maybe he had lost track of time. But their words sounded thin, paper covering fire. Mitchell began canvassing the towel block, asking questions with a calm that belied the urgency in his pen. Did anyone see him leave school? Did anyone notice a vehicle parked nearby? The fragments surfaced. The van, the red cap, the indistinct figure. By 6 p.m., Laura was trembling, her voice hoarse from calling her son's name into the thickening evening air. She clutched Ethan's diorama of planets, still waiting on the kitchen table, as if the painted styrofoam might anchor her to him. Daniel paced the yard in widening circles, his boots grinding gravel, each turn more frantic than the last. The ordinary hum of Maplewood Lane, dogs barking, lawnmowers whirring, faded as silence spread across the neighborhood. It was the silence of people listening, waiting for a sound that never came. At 6:22, the yo-yo changed hands. Carl Red Thompson, rummaging through alleys for cans and bottles, spotted it lying beside a dumpster. Its string was frayed, its red plastic scuffed but still gleaming faintly in the fading light. He pocketed it without a second thought, muttering about luck. He would not know until days later that he was holding the last toy Ethan had touched. Meanwhile, testimonies multiplied. Jeremy Clark, a classmate, told his parents at dinner that he had seen Ethan walking toward the east exit, alone. He remembered because Ethan had promised to show him a new yo-yo trick the next day. Another student recalled a man leaning against the chain-link fence, handing out baseball cards, though he couldn't describe the face. These voices formed a chorus of uncertainty, each note adding to the haunting melody of what-ifs. The weather turned subtly as the evening deepened. Clouds gathered from the west, their underbellies glowing orange from the setting sun. The air thickened with the smell of rain approaching, a dampness clinging to skin and fabric. Birds fell silent, replaced by the distant growl of thunder. It was as though the sky itself sensed the wrongness, preparing to wash the day clean, but too late, to erase its damage. By 7, key volunteers were already fanning out. Neighbors who had once shared casual greetings now carried flashlights and walked shoulder to shoulder through yards and alleys. At 7:15, Ethan's name rang through the air, shouted in desperate rhythms that echoed against empty garages and fences. "Ethan!" called again and again, the name losing its warmth, turning into a plea. Inside the Cole home, Laura sat at the kitchen table, the receiver of the phone pressed white against her knuckles. She dialed every number she knew. Tommy's family, relatives, across town, colleagues at the school. Each answer was the same. No one had seen him. The plate of cookies she had set out at 4 o'clock still sat untouched, their chocolate chips hardened by the cool air. Every detail became a weapon of grief. The folded napkin with a doodle of a rocket in his lunchbox, the empty chair at the table, the faint imprint of his sneakers on the hallway rug. At 7:43, the first storm drops struck the pavement, releasing the smell of wet asphalt mixed with gasoline residue from passing cars. Rain spread quickly, drumming rooftops, blurring the light from street lamps into halos. The searchers trudged on, their flashlights cutting thin beams through sheets of water. Police dogs arrived at 8:14, straining against leashes, but the rain muddied scents and washed away traces before they could be followed. By 8:47, the storm had fully claimed the night, each clap of thunder punctuating the family's growing despair. Witnesses later remembered the look in Laura's eyes that evening, wide, unblinking, as if refusing to accept what her heart already knew. Daniel stood beside her, soaked to the bone, his fists clenched so tightly that his nails left crescents in his palms. The search continued, but already the shadow of fear had lengthened into something darker. That was the first night without Ethan, a night where the sound of his name carried into darkness, met only by the relentless drum of rain and the echo of unanswered silence. By midnight, Maplewood Lane was unrecognizable. What had been a quiet suburban street just hours before now pulsed with flashlights, radios, and the low murmur of coordinated voices. Squad cars lined the curbs, their red and blue lights flickering across windows like restless ghosts. Neighbors huddled in coats despite the muggy air, whispering theories, their faces pale in the glow of porch lamps. Every shadow seemed suspicious. Every sound became a possibility. Yet the boy remained absent, his laughter replaced by static. On police radios, at 12:15 a.m., Officer Mitchell gathered volunteers beneath the awning of Willow Creek Elementary. His notes were smudged by rain, but he recited the last known timeline: Ethan leaving class at 2:51, the blurry figure at 2:52, both gone at 2:53. He marked the alley where the yo-yo had been found, the corner where Margaret Cooper had seen the van, and the fence where a classmate thought someone had been handing out cards. None of it fit neatly together, but urgency replaced logic. Groups spread out again, combing fields, storm drains, and empty lots. At 1 a.m., the thunder relented, leaving only the dripping of gutters and the hiss of wet tires on pavement. The air smelled metallic, charged, as if the storm had left behind more than water. Laura, wrapped in a damp coat, stood on her porch calling Ethan's name into the night. Her voice cracked, her throat raw, but still she called. Daniel moved like a machine beside her, his steps stiff, his words few. He clutched Ethan's jacket, the denim one with the missing button, as if it were both weapon and shield. The testimonies collected that night blurred into contradictions. Some insisted they had seen a tall man near the playground earlier in the week. Others swore they had noticed nothing unusual. A teenager claimed he saw Ethan near the convenience store at 3:30, but his account faltered under questioning. Each statement piled upon the next until the truth became a maze of half-formed memories, and in that maze, Ethan's trail vanished. At 2:22 a.m., officers paused near a drainage ditch behind Oak Street. Something glimmered in the beam of a flashlight, a sheet of paper, damp and torn. When lifted carefully, it revealed itself as a note in green crayon. Letters, shaky but familiar. "Mom, going to Tommy's after school. Promise I'll be back for dinner. Love you." It was the note Ethan had left on the refrigerator that morning, somehow carried away from home, discarded in mud. How it had traveled there, no one knew. It only deepened the riddle. Inside the Cole house, the contrast was unbearable. Ethan's room stood untouched, the bed still neatly made, the science project still balanced on the table. Glow-in-the-dark stars dotted the ceiling above the emptiness. His backpack, missing from his shoulder in the last video frame, was nowhere to be found. Laura sat on the edge of his bed, clutching the stuffed bear Ethan had outgrown, but never fully abandoned. The bear smelled faintly of crayons and dust, its fur worn from years of embraces. Daniel stood in the doorway, unable to cross the threshold, as though stepping inside would confirm the worst. The night dragged on, minutes folding into hours. By 3 a.m., fatigue dulled voices, but no one left. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves carried potential. Search dogs circled, noses pressed to wet earth, but rain had scrubbed the ground clean of clues. Radios crackled with updates that amounted to nothing. Negative on the east lot. Nothing behind the factory. Still searching. Hope thinned with each report. The silence of absence became oppressive. The ordinary sounds of night, the chirp of crickets, the hum of distant traffic felt like mockery. Maplewood Lane was consumed not by darkness, but by a hollow, vibrating stillness. And in that stillness, despair took root. By dawn, the first, light revealed weary faces, clothing plastered to skin, eyes red from both rain and tears. The Coles had not slept. They stood together on the porch as the sun broke across the neighborhood, a new day rising indifferent to their loss. Volunteers drifted away to change clothes or rest, but the search continued, thin and relentless. That morning, the town awoke to posters being printed, faxes being sent to nearby police departments, phone calls spreading like fire. Ethan Coles, a name, his face, his description, striped shirt, denim jacket, red sneakers, were broadcast everywhere. By noon, the first flyers appeared on lampposts, stapled over old garage sale notices. By evening, his photograph stared from grocery store, windows, and post office walls. The disappearance was no longer just the Cole family's tragedy. It was now the town's story, the community's wound. The day after, reporters arrived, cameras rolling, voices solemn. The narrative spread outward. 9-year-old boy missing. Last seen leaving school. Possible abduction. Each word carved deeper into the lives of Laura and Daniel, their grief transformed into public record. And so, within less than 24 hours, the ordinariness of June 13th had been erased. The weather, Thalilax, the laughter of recess, all of it became backdrop for a single truth. A child had stepped out of view and into the void. The first 48 hours after Ethan Cole vanished were chaos disguised as procedure. At 6 p.m. on June 13th, Officer Mitchell filed the first official report. Male child, 9 years, last seen exiting east door of Willow Creek Elementary, wearing striped shirt, denim jacket, red sneakers. The paper was handwritten, later typed by a secretary on an aging typewriter. Even at this earliest stage, errors crept in. The report listed his jacket as navy rather than denim, his sneakers as white instead of red. Small mistakes, but they would echo later, muddling witnesses and confusing searchers. By 6:45 p.m., Detective James Rowland, a 23-year veteran of the Lansing Police Department, was assigned to lead the case. Rowland knew the first 2 days determined everything. Statistics showed if a child was not found within 48 hours, the chance of recovery plummeted. But resources in 1995 were limited. There were no Amber Alerts, no cell phone tracking, no instant social media campaigns. Leads depended on faxes, phone calls, and boots on the ground. At 7:00 p.m., Rowland expanded the search perimeter to 5 miles, calling in off-duty officers and volunteers. Maps were pinned to bulletin boards in the station, pushpins marking alleys, fields, and rivers. Without GPS, coordination was guesswork. Radios crackled with half-clear updates, static erasing crucial words. 2 teams searched the same block twice, while another block went unchecked until the following morning. By 8 p.m., the rain arrived, erasing footprints, scattering scent trails, turning chalk notes into smeared hieroglyphs on sidewalks. Search. Dogs deployed an hour later lost Ethan's trail within minutes. Their handlers cursed softly, knowing evidence was dissolving before their eyes. At 9:15 p.m., Rowland held a press briefing in front of the police station. Cameras from 2 local channels recorded him stating, "We are doing everything possible. The community's help is vital." Behind him, Ethan's school portrait was taped to the podium. Reporters asked about suspects. Rowland dodged, emphasizing that all possibilities remain open. That night, the story aired on evening news, but outside Michigan, no one yet paid attention. By 11 p.m., false leads began to surface. A gas station attendant insisted he saw a boy matching Ethan's description with a man in a red pickup. He described the man in detail: gray beard, eagle tattoo, mid-50s. The tip triggered a county-wide manhunt with 17 officers, interrogating truck owners through the night. By morning, each had airtight alibis. The witness later admitted he had been drinking before his shift, confusing Ethan with another child. 17 hours wasted. At 2 a.m., another blow landed. Rookie Officer Peter Dalton transcribed Harold Finch's testimony about seeing a boy climb into a van near Oak and 3rd. In haste, Dalton wrote, "Oak and 33rd, an intersection that did not exist." Search teams were deployed 7 miles west, combing irrelevant streets, while the real corner lay ignored for 5 crucial days. By the time the error was noticed, rain and traffic had obliterated any physical trace of the van. Morning of June 14th, flyers rolled off the station's old copier. Ethan's face, grainy but recognizable, appeared above the words, "Missing Child." Volunteers stapled them to telephone poles, taped them to grocery store doors, shoved them through mail slots. Phones at the station rang constantly, each caller offering a theory. Some swore they saw Ethan at a diner, others at a mall. Every tip was logged, but only a handful investigated. The department's manpower was stretched thin, and Rowland had to choose which whispers to chase. At 10 a.m., Officers visited the school to collect security tapes. Willow Creek Elementary had only one functioning camera, recording on 6-hour VHS tapes that were reused every 2 days. By the time investigators requested them, the tape from June 13th had already been recorded over. Only the grainy footage from the day before remained, useless except for confirming Ethan's presence on June 12th. Another door closed. By noon, detectives interviewed Ethan's classmates. Children's testimonies spilled contradictions. He walked east, he walked west, he was alone, he was with a man. Some details were consistent: the red yo-yo, the scar above his eyebrow, his striped shirt, yet the noise outweighed the clarity, and Roland's notes became a maze of crossed out guesses. Teachers insisted Ethan was cheerful that day, engaged in class, nothing unusual. To investigators, that meant little. At 2:00 p.m., suspicion turned inward. An anonymous call suggested investigators look at Daniel Cole, the father. Rumors spread quickly. A parent under pressure, a man with temper, maybe secrets. By 3 p.m., Daniel was subjected to questions about finances, work records, even his whereabouts the night before. He volunteered for a polygraph, which produced inconclusive results, the machine reading more grief than guilt. Still, suspicion lingered, straining the investigation further. By 6 p.m., exactly 24 hours since Ethan walked out of frame, the case was already wobbling under the weight of confusion. Leads contradicted each other, evidence dissolved in rain, and human error carved holes in the timeline. In living rooms across Lansing, Ethan's face stared from the evening news, his smile frozen above a hotline number. Hope remained, but already doubt whispered. The first day had ended, and with each misstep the possibility of finding Ethan alive grew thinner. The second day began with exhaustion, already etched into the investigation. June 14th opened with a pale grey sky and damp streets, reminders of the storm that had washed away so much. Officers returned to the Cole home at 6:30 a.m., asking the same questions in different tones. Did Ethan mention meeting anyone? Did he ever talk about strangers? Was there a relative he might have gone to see? Laura repeated her answers with a mechanical calm, her voice hollow from sleeplessness. Daniel grew short, his temper simmering at the implication that they were being treated more as suspects than parents. At 8 a.m., Detective Roland convened a meeting at headquarters. Coffee steamed in paper cups, maps spread across the wall, pushpins marking sightings that contradicted one another. Volunteers and officers crowded into the cramped briefing room. Roland emphasized the ticking clock. We are now 30 hours in. The first 48 are critical. His voice carried weight, but his eyes betrayed fatigue. By mid-morning, the phone lines were overwhelmed. Tips poured in. Ethan was seen at a mall food court, at a bus station, even on a farm outside the county. Each call required a log entry, yet the sheer volume made thorough investigation impossible. Clerks scribbled on notepads, handwriting blurring into illegibility. One tip, logged at 10:15 a.m., described a van matching Margaret Cooper's account, parked near an abandoned warehouse. Due to backlog, it was not dispatched until 4 p.m. By then, the vehicle was gone. Meanwhile, evidence handling showed cracks. At 11 a.m., officers collected Ethan's clothing from the laundry basket in his room to compare fibers with the yo-yo. The items were sealed in plastic bags, yet someone mislabeled the evidence tags, transposing case numbers. When the lab opened the bags 2 days later, the mix-up required hours of clarification before testing could even begin. Those hours mattered, though no one could measure how much. Witness statements also faltered under pressure. At noon, 12-year-old Bobby Miller swore he had seen Ethan near the corner store around 3:30 on the day of disappearance. Detectives questioned him for over an hour, pressing details. Later, his mother admitted Bobby had been at home the entire afternoon. He had invented the story for attention, leaving investigators to waste precious time chasing a phantom lead. By 2:00 p.m., the atmosphere in the Cole household was suffocating. Laura sat in Ethan's room, refusing to leave the blue-painted walls and the glow-in-the-dark stars that no longer offered comfort. Reporters gathered on the lawn, cameras pointed at the windows. Headlines began to form. Boy missing after. School. Police struggled to find leads. Daniel, overwhelmed, confronted one cameraman, shouting for them to leave, his grief broadcast on the evening news as though it were evidence of guilt. That afternoon, suspicion fell again on Timothy. Jacobs, the school janitor. A student claimed to have seen Ethan talking to him near the east exit. When police searched Jacobs' locker, they found a baseball card, Ken Griffey Jr., 1989 Upper Deck, allegedly belonging to Ethan. The discovery spread quickly through the ranks, the first tangible link in the case. Jacobs was arrested at 3:45 p.m., interrogated for 18 hours without an attorney. He swore the card had been a gift from Ethan after Jacobs helped retrieve his basketball from the roof. 3 other students confirmed the story, but only days later. In the meantime, Jacobs' reputation was shredded, his face splashed across the news as a potential predator. The wasted effort came at a heavy cost. While detectives funneled resources into Jacobs, real leads went stale. Finch's birdwatcher testimony, already corrupted by the Oak and 33rd typo, languished in a file. The warehouse sighting of the van remained unresolved. The community, desperate for resolution, clung to Jacobs as the villain, while the true trail slipped further away. By 6:00 p.m., exactly 48 hours since Ethan walked out of the school, Roland faced the press again. This time his words were more cautious. "We are pursuing multiple avenues. We ask the public to remain vigilant." Behind him, Laura wept silently, supported by Daniel's rigid frame. Reporters asked about Jacobs, about the van, about the possibility Ethan had run away. Each question pierced like an accusation. Roland's careful answers revealed what everyone sensed. The case was already staggering under the weight of confusion. The second day ended as the first had, empty-handed. Posters multiplied, phones rang without pause, volunteers marched through fields with flashlights, yet each hour without Ethan widened the gulf between hope and truth. What should have been clarity became chaos, and what should have been evidence became noise. The investigation was no longer just a search, it was a tangle of errors, a labyrinth built by desperation. And somewhere within that labyrinth, the boy was still missing, his trail fading faster with every mistake. By the morning of June 15th, the investigation had already begun to show the cracks of exhaustion and misdirection. Officers who had slept only in shifts returned to their posts with bloodshot eyes, their uniforms wrinkled, their voices hoarse. From repeating the same questions, the Cole family watched from behind curtains as strangers combed their neighborhood, the house no longer their sanctuary, but the epicenter of a spreading storm. Every creak of a floorboard, every knock at the door carried with it the cruel hope that Ethan would step inside. At 9:00 a.m., detectives pursued a new lead. A caller claimed to have spotted a boy resembling Ethan at a McDonald's 40 miles away. A team was dispatched, only to discover a child with a similar haircut eating fries with his parents. By 11:30, another report came from a bus station, describing a boy boarding with a man in a red cap. Investigators rushed, only to find the bus had already departed. They phoned ahead to intercept, but the child in question was identified quickly as someone else. Each false lead drained resources and morale, while the real trail grew colder by the hour. At 2:00 p.m., the department doubled back to Jacobs, the janitor. Though 3 students had corroborated his story, suspicion lingered. Reporters amplified the rumor, painting him as the likely culprit. Protesters even gathered outside his apartment. Under pressure, detectives released him at 6 p.m., citing insufficient evidence. But the damage was done. The community's focus had narrowed onto a scapegoat, leaving little room for new theories. Jacobs packed his belongings 2 months later and left town, his life permanently scarred by an accusation that would never be erased. Meanwhile, the evidence pile grew confusing rather than clear. The yo-yo, belatedly identified, was tested for fingerprints. Rain and handling had degraded any residue, leaving nothing usable. Fibers found on the string were sent to the state lab, but processing times stretched into weeks. The note, written in green crayon, recovered near the drainage ditch, provided no leads beyond confirming what Laura already knew. It was her son's handwriting. Instead of clarity, each artifact deepened the sense of helplessness. Technology, or the lack of it, became the investigation's invisible adversary. VHS cameras had already taped over the crucial moments. Toll booths kept paper logs that were incomplete and already discarded by the time police asked. Phone records were maintained manually, requiring weeks to retrieve. DNA testing, though possible, was prohibitively slow and costly, and the budget for the department allowed only a handful of samples each year. Every missed opportunity felt like a door closing, locking the truth behind it forever. By June 20th, the case turned inward again. An anonymous tip alleged that Daniel Cole had been seen acting strangely near Lake Haven the day after Ethan disappeared. The source of the tip was never confirmed, but it pulled investigators toward the grieving father once more. Daniel agreed to 2 polygraph tests, but his grief clouded the results, yielding inconclusive readings. For nearly a week, officers shadowed him, questioned co-workers, and even dug shallow pits in the Cole backyard. The community watched in horror as suspicion fell squarely on a man already hollowed by loss. When nothing was found, the investigation limped back to square one, but trust had been fractured. The days turned into weeks. Flyers yellowed on telephone poles, their edges curling in the summer heat. Volunteers dwindled, returning to work, their lives unable to remain frozen in grief. By July, media coverage had thinned, reporters chasing fresher tragedies. For the Coles, silence became the loudest presence in their home. Ethan's room remained untouched, each toy and book a museum. Exhibit of a life interrupted, Detective Rowland filed his year-end report in December. The language was clinical, stripped of the anguish that defined those days. No viable new leads. Case remains active, but without dedicated resource allocation. It was the bureaucratic way of saying what everyone already knew. The trail had gone cold. The investigation's errors became its legacy. The mistyped street name that wasted 5 crucial days, the false suspect who absorbed weeks of focus, the contradictory witness accounts logged but never reconciled, the tapes erased before anyone asked for them. Together, these failures stitched a tragic truth. Not only had Ethan disappeared, but so had the chances of finding him. For the Cole family, those 48 hours stretched into years. Hope became a ritual, pain became routine. And for the town, the case of Ethan Cole shifted from immediate crisis to haunting folklore, spoken about in lowered voices with phrases like "the boy who vanished," replacing his name. The first chapter of the investigation had ended, not with resolution but with silence. And silence, once it takes hold, has a way of growing louder with every passing year. The years after Ethan Cole's disappearance settled like a fog, thick and unrelenting. The search that had once filled streets with voices and flashlights shrank into a whisper carried only by his family. For Laura and Daniel, time did not move forward. It only circled back to the afternoon of June 13, 1995. Every day afterward was measured against that silence. Every year another echo of the boy who never came home. Laura clung to rituals, fragile anchors in a sea of uncertainty. Each year on Ethan's birthday, she baked a cake with 9 candles, then 10, then 11, continuing long after he should have been too old for such traditions. She placed the cake in his room, the glow of the candles illuminating the blue walls and the constellation stickers still clinging to the ceiling. She sang softly, her voice trembling, waiting for a boy who could not blow the candles out. On June 13th, the day of his disappearance, she lit a single white candle in the window at 2:53 p.m., the exact minute he vanished from the camera's frame. Neighbors grew accustomed to that small flicker of flame glowing against the dusk, a signal of grief too steady to ignore. Daniel's grief took a different form. At first, he drowned himself in work, adding extra shifts at the auto plant, hands blackened by grease, eyes rimmed with fatigue. But work could not outpace the silence. By 1998, bottles began to pile in the garage, the sharp smell of whiskey clinging to the air. He was arrested for driving under the influence in 2001, his mugshot a hollow reflection of the man who had once carried his son on his shoulders at Lake Haven. His marriage suffered under the weight of shared sorrow that fractured instead of binding them. Arguments grew sharp, words turned bitter, until silence fell heavier than speech. In 2004, Laura filed for separation. By the following year, they were divorced, united only in loss, but unable to live under the same roof of memory. The house on Maplewood Lane remained Laura's sanctuary and prison. She refused to change Ethan's room, leaving the glow-in-the-dark stars intact, the stuffed bear on his bed, the solar system diorama resting on his desk. Dust gathered, but nothing was touched. It became less a child's room and more a shrine. A frozen snapshot of 1995. Visitors entered with hushed voices, as though disturbing the stillness might unravel the fragile threads keeping Laura upright. She spent evenings sitting on his bed, reading aloud from The Hobbit, her voice catching when she reached passages he had once loved. Over the years, false hope became its own form of cruelty. In 2003, a woman swore she had seen Ethan working at a diner in Indiana. The Coles drove 5 hours that same night, hearts pounding with anticipation. They found a teenager with a similar scar above his eyebrow, but he was someone else entirely. In 2007, a national television show on unsolved cases aired Ethan's story, presenting an age-progressed photo created by FBI software. Calls flooded, in sightings from Chicago, Denver, even Portland. Each one demanded investigation, each one dissolved into disappointment. One man, claiming to be Ethan, submitted himself for DNA testing. When the results came back negative, Laura collapsed in the hospital from what doctors called stress-induced cardiomyopathy, a broken heart. Private investigators promised answers in exchange for money the Coles didn't have. Laura emptied savings once, hiring an investigator who claimed to have traced Ethan to Phoenix. For months he mailed her photographs of a young man, convinced it was her son. When she finally confronted the stranger, she learned he was a runaway from another state. The investigator disappeared with her remaining funds, leaving her not only broke, but more broken than before. By 2010, Laura's health began to fail. Years of stress manifested as tremors in her hands, forgetfulness in her speech. Doctors diagnosed early-onset dementia by 2015, a condition they quietly suggested had been accelerated by chronic grief. On some days, she forgot Ethan was gone and prepared dinner for him. On others, she relived his disappearance as though it had happened yesterday, collapsing under the weight of memory. Daniel found sobriety in 2012, attending meetings and rebuilding his life in small, careful steps. He lived alone in a modest apartment, walls bare, except for a single framed photo of Ethan, taken the summer before he vanished. He visited Laura every Sunday, bringing groceries and sitting quietly beside her. Sometimes she recognized him, sometimes she did not. But always, when the subject turned to Ethan, her eyes filled with the same ache they had carried for decades. The case file, once thick with reports, grew dusty in storage. Detective Rowland, retired by 2010, kept a copy in his basement, flipping through the pages each anniversary as though one overlooked detail might leap out. It never did. The official record called it inactive. The community called it forgotten. But for Laura and Daniel, forgetting was impossible. Silence became their companion, and hope, though fragile, never fully died. Then came 2020, the year. The world itself went silent, streets emptied by lockdowns, human contact reduced to glowing screens. It was in that silence, on an ordinary video call, that a face appeared. A face carrying a scar above the eyebrow, a birthmark on the arm, eyes that had once stared out from milk cartons and flyers. Recognition struck like lightning. And for the first time in 25 years, silence began to crack. The rediscovery of Ethan's story did not happen all at once. It began as a whisper, an uneasy thought buried in the back of Marcus Henderson's mind during that spring morning in 2020. While the rest of the world was consumed by masks, lockdowns, and case counts, Marcus was consumed by a single face. The man on his Zoom screen looked ordinary to everyone else. An analyst named Daniel Ward, quiet, reliable, even forgettable. But to Marcus, the resemblance to the missing boy from his hometown was like staring into a mirror held up by time. He tried to dismiss it, telling himself that grief and memory could distort faces. Yet the scar above the eyebrow, the faint birthmark on the arm, the nervous way Daniel avoided looking into the camera, it was all too precise. That night, unable to sleep, Marcus opened his laptop and typed a name he had not spoken in decades, Ethan Cole. Search results bloomed across the screen. Old newspaper articles, yellowed photographs scanned and posted by strangers, age-progressed images that tried to guess what a 9-year-old would look like at 34. Marcus compared them to the screenshots he had taken during the meeting. The overlap was chilling. The story of Ethan Cole had faded from headlines, but online, in forgotten corners of forums and Facebook groups, his name still pulsed. A page maintained by Laura's cousin shared photographs of the boy, his schoolwork, his toys. Scrolling through it felt like time travel, and Marcus could not escape the sense that the man working for him was somehow bound to this vanished child. Technology, the very thing that had failed in 1995, now offered possibilities unimaginable then. Marcus reached out to an old college friend, now an FBI cybercrimes agent. He sent the screenshots, cautious but insistent. "Tell me I'm wrong," he wrote. Within hours, the images were run through facial recognition software. Results came back with percentages too high to ignore: 94%, 95%, 96%. Matches across multiple systems, all pointing to one conclusion: Daniel Ward was almost certainly Ethan Cole. Still, probability was not proof. The FBI agent suggested quiet steps. They obtained Daniel's employment records. His background suspiciously began in 1996 with no trace before. His social security number had been issued late, when he should already have been 10 years old. His high school transcripts listed him as a transfer with no prior schooling. Each line of his paper identity revealed gaps patched together like a hastily mended fabric. By April, circumstances offered a strange opportunity. During the pandemic, companies sent employees at-home health kits, including cheek swabs for routine screenings. With legal maneuvers few could follow, one such kit was intercepted. The sample was tested against DNA voluntarily provided years earlier by Laura and Daniel Cole. The result was undeniable. The probability of maternal relation was beyond 99.99%. The missing boy had been found, but discovery did not mean resolution. Questions multiplied. Where had Ethan been for 25 years? Who had taken him? Why had he been allowed to grow into adulthood under another name? Investigators began, retracing old files, cross-referencing forgotten leads. The mistyped report of Oak and 33rd resurfaced. The janitor once accused, the warehouse sighting, the red van, all threads now re-evaluated with modern eyes. What had been chaos in 1995 became patterns under new technology. For Laura and Daniel, the revelation came not as relief, but as a storm. Laura, living in a care facility by then, was told carefully. Some days she understood, whispering, "My boy, he's alive." Other days her memory fractured, leaving her waiting for a 9-year-old to walk through the door. Daniel, older, sober, steadier, reacted with a mix of rage and gratitude. Rage at the decades stolen, gratitude that Ethan had survived at all. He sat alone in his apartment the night he received the call, staring at the single-framed photo on his wall, whispering through clenched teeth, "We found you." The world had changed since 1995, and so had the tools of justice. Where once VHS tapes blurred, now high-definition screenshots revealed scars with clarity. Where once faxes jammed, no databases cross-referenced in seconds. Where once DNA tests took months, now they took hours. Technology had finally outrun silence, forcing it to surrender what it had hidden. And yet, for all its precision, technology could not answer the most haunting question. What had happened to Ethan during the missing years? That truth remained, locked behind the quiet eyes of the man once known as Daniel Ward, who lived unaware that his carefully constructed life was about to collapse. The revelation was coming, inevitable as sunrise. The silence of 25 years was ending, and the story was about to break wide open. The silence that had stretched for 25 years ended not with a dramatic announcement, but with a whisper of truth spreading through the right people at the right time. By May 2020, investigators had quietly confirmed what Marcus suspected. Daniel Ward, the reserved analyst who avoided small talk and company events, was in fact Ethan Cole. The boy who had vanished at age 9 was alive, working in spreadsheets, attending virtual meetings, living as though the past had been erased. But the past was never erased. It had only been buried, waiting for a moment when technology and chance would converge to dig it back up. The discovery demanded caution. Agents could not simply knock on his door and declare him found. They needed context. Who had given him his false identity? Who had hidden him? Who might still be involved? As they traced records, they uncovered anomalies. The shell company that had provided Daniel's first apartment lease, the lawyer who filed papers in 1996 only to die suddenly 5 years later, the consistent pattern of money transfers that kept him afloat through college. It became clear Ethan had not just slipped into a new life by accident, someone had engineered it. For weeks, surveillance filled the silence. Investigators monitored Daniel's phone, his emails, his online habits. They found little that suggested guilt. His life was quiet, almost painfully ordinary. He ordered takeout, played chess online, read history books. He had friends at work who described him as kind but distant, the kind of man who never shared. Stories from childhood, who always redirected conversations to safe topics like sports scores or technology trends. That absence of a past, once overlooked, now glared like a spotlight. The family was briefed slowly. Daniel Cole, now in his 50s, sat across from federal agents in a small conference room, his hands folded tightly. He listened as they laid out the evidence, the DNA, the photographs, the records. For years, he had kept Ethan's file in his basement, rereading it, convinced the case had been swallowed forever. When he heard the words, "We found him," his jaw clenched, his eyes wet. He whispered only once, "Tell me he's safe." Laura's reaction was more fragile. On her lucid days, when memory aligned, she could absorb the revelation. She would reach for her son's photo on the dresser and murmur, "You came back to me." But on other days, she was lost in loops of confusion, waiting for 9-year-old Ethan to walk through the front door, dinner set at the table. Her mind could not reconcile that the boy in the striped shirt was now a man in his 30s. For the community, the news spread more slowly. Word leaked that something significant had been discovered. Old neighbors called each other, voices tinged with disbelief. "They say Ethan's alive." For those who had marched with flashlights, who had stapled his poster to telephone poles, the rumor was surreal. Could a ghost truly return after so long? By summer, investigators were preparing for confrontation. They arranged interviews, not only to confirm identity, but to piece together the years between 1995 and 2020. The boy had vanished in an instant, but the man had lived decades. The missing puzzle piece was no longer his location. It was his story. Where had he been kept? By whom? Why had he been allowed to grow into adulthood under an invented name? Daniel, Ethan himself, was unaware of the storm gathering around him. He continued his remote work, his routine unbroken, but he felt the edges fray. For weeks, he had the sensation of being watched, of something shifting beyond his control. He began writing more in his journal, long entries about memories he thought he had forgotten, the smell of lilacs, the squeak of swings, the feeling of a yo-yo string cutting into his palm. Memories he had suppressed returned, uninvited, filling his nights with restless dreams. The suspense reached its breaking point one humid morning in June 2020. Ethan logged into another routine video meeting, unaware that on the other side of the screen sat not only his co-workers, but an agent watching closely, waiting for confirmation. His camera flickered, his face illuminated by sunlight, and the scar above his eyebrow glowed faintly in the frame. For investigators, it was the final visual proof. For Marcus, it was the confirmation that what he had carried alone for weeks was no hallucination. The truth had surfaced. After decades of silence, the missing boy was no longer missing. But silence rarely breaks cleanly. Behind the discovery lay questions darker than anyone wanted to face, about complicity, about the people who had orchestrated an abduction, about how a child's life could be rewritten in plain sight. And so, while the world outside hid from a virus, another hidden story began to unspool. A revelation that would not only bring Ethan back into light, but also expose the shadows that had kept him there. The silence was ending, and with it came the storm. The storm of truth arrived quietly, then detonated. On June 22, 2020, federal agents gathered outside a modest apartment complex in San Diego. They had spent weeks preparing, collecting enough evidence to ensure the arrest would hold. Inside, apartment 4B lived Daniel Ward, or rather Ethan Cole, unaware that the walls of secrecy built around his life were about to collapse. But the real target was not only Ethan's rediscovery, it was the man who had created Daniel Ward in the first place. Through surveillance, agents had traced Ethan's orbit back to a retired school custodian named Richard Hale. His name had appeared once in a footnote of the 1995 investigation, a temporary janitor working at Willow Creek Elementary during the 2 weeks surrounding Ethan's disappearance. At the time, he had slipped through unnoticed, dismissed as irrelevant. But Hale's name surfaced again in 2020, linked to the forged documents that established Daniel Ward's new identity. When agents raided Hale's house, they found more than dusty furniture and faded photographs. Hidden in a locked cabinet was a collection of files, birth certificates, school transcripts, social security cards, all fabricated. Among them was Ethan's. But worse still, there were records of at least 4 other children, names that matched unsolved missing persons. Cases from the early 1990s, Hale had not acted alone. He had been part of a network, small but deliberate, of adults who believed they could reassign children into new lives, severing them from their families. The discovery of Hale's files turned suspicion into certainty, and Hale himself, cornered in his kitchen while agents rifled through drawers, did not deny it. "I gave him a life," he muttered, his voice trembling, "better than the one he had." But his words rang hollow in the presence of the files, in the face of 25 years of silence inflicted on a family. Among the seized evidence was a journal. The first entry, dated September 1995, was written in a shaky hand. "He doesn't stop crying. He still asks for his mother. I tell him his old life is gone." The entries that followed revealed the systematic dismantling of a child's identity, punishments for speaking his real name, rewards for answering to Daniel. Pages described isolation, schooling at home, the planting of false memories. It was not the record of a rescuer, it was the diary of a captor. Investigators also uncovered audio recordings stored on cassette tapes. On them, Ethan's young voice could be heard, hesitant, broken. "Can I call home? Please, just once." Hale's voice answered coldly, "You don't have a home anymore." The tapes, decades old, carried static, but the words were clear, enough to freeze the agents listening. These were no longer just suspicions, they were confessions etched in Hale's own hand and voice. When the evidence was laid before Ethan, now an adult, he sat in stunned silence. For years, he had avoided confronting the fragments of memory he carried, the basement room, the endless drills of reciting his new name, the punishments when he resisted. Seeing the journal confirmed what he had once doubted. He had not imagined it. His childhood had been rewritten deliberately, cruelly. The anger came late, quiet but sharp. "He stole me," Ethan whispered. "He didn't give me a life. He stole the one I already had." The arrest of Richard Hale was the beginning of a reckoning. Neighbors were stunned. They remembered him as a quiet old man who tended roses in his front yard, who nodded politely at the grocery store. No one suspected he had carried a secret that spanned decades. The press descended quickly, cameras flashing, headlines screaming. "Missing boy found after 25 years. Retired janitor arrested in cold case." For Laura and Daniel, the news was both salvation and torment. They had their son back, but in a form they could barely recognize. The boy in the striped shirt was gone, replaced by a man carrying scars invisible to the eye. Reunions were tentative, strained, layered with tears and silence. Laura wept uncontrollably the first time she saw him, clutching his hand as though afraid he might vanish again. Daniel's embrace was stiff, his voice low. "I'm sorry, son. I couldn't protect." "You!" Ethan said nothing, the words too heavy to speak. As Hale awaited trial, the case became a national fixation. Reporters dissected every page of his journal, every second of the tapes. Some speculated about others who might have been involved, about the children listed in his files who had never been found. For the Cole family, the noise was unbearable. What they needed was quiet, but quiet had never brought them peace. The confrontation had begun, but it was only the first step. What followed would be the slow, painful unraveling of truth inside a courtroom, where justice would finally confront the silence of decades. The trial of Richard Hale began in November 2021, more than a year after Ethan's rediscovery. By then, the story had grown beyond the borders of Michigan or California. It had become a national fixation. Camera crews camped outside the courthouse, their lenses waiting to capture a glimpse of the man accused of erasing a child's identity for 25 years. The headlines called it the case of the stolen childhood. For the Cole family, it was simply the reckoning they had been denied for decades. Inside the courtroom, the air was taut, each breath measured. The prosecution wasted no time. They presented Hale as a manipulator who exploited the chaos of 1995, inserting himself into the school during a critical window of vulnerability. They unveiled the cabinet of forged documents, the handwritten journals, and the cassette tapes where Ethan's childlike pleas had been met with chilling denials. Each item was stacked on a table before the jury, a physical weight that pressed on the room. The defense attempted to argue diminished capacity. Hale's attorney claimed he had acted under the delusion that he was rescuing children from broken homes. They painted him as a misguided man, not a criminal. But the evidence was merciless. The journal entries, methodical and cold, described Ethan's resistance, the punishments, the slow breaking of his will. One passage was read aloud. He cried for 3 nights straight. By the 4th, he stopped using the name Ethan. The words echoed in the hushed chamber, leaving even the most hardened jurors shaken. Witnesses followed. Former colleagues from Willow Creek Elementary recalled Hale's brief employment in 1995, his habit of lingering near the playground, his eagerness to chat with children. Neighbors from San Diego testified to his strange routines, how he rarely allowed visitors inside, how Daniel Ward, Ethan, always seemed withdrawn, as if living under invisible chains. The most powerful testimony came from Ethan himself. On the 2nd week of the trial, he took the stand. Dressed simply, his hands trembling, he faced the man who had stolen his childhood. His voice faltered at first, then steadied. He told me my family didn't want me. He told me I had no choice but to become someone else. And for years, I believed him. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the scratch of pens, recording his words. He spoke of the basement room, the forced routines, the punishments for disobedience. He confessed the guilt he carried for surviving while his parents suffered. I knew who I was, he said, eyes fixed on Hale, but he made me doubt whether anyone else remembered me. Hale sat impassive throughout, his expression a mask. Only once did he speak during cross-examination when pressed about the tapes. His reply was cold. I gave him structure. He would have wasted away without me. The jurors recoiled at the audacity of it, at the refusal to acknowledge the harm. It was the moment the case turned irrevocably against him. For weeks, the court dissected every scrap of evidence. Experts explained how Hale had acquired fake documents through a network of corrupt officials in the mid-1990s. Digital analysts traced the money that had kept Ethan afloat, payments funneled through shell companies Hale controlled. Psychologists testified about the trauma inflicted by long-term identity manipulation, describing it as a form of captivity even more insidious than chains. On December 17, 2021, the jury returned after only 5 hours of deliberation. Their verdict: guilty on all counts, kidnapping, identity fraud, conspiracy, and child endangerment. The judge, his voice steady but grave, sentenced Richard Hale to 325 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. "You stole a life," he declared, "not just from a child, but from his family, his community, and from time itself. Justice demands that you spend the rest of your days in silence." Laura, frail and seated in a wheelchair, was allowed to address the court during the victim impact statements. Her words cut through the silence. "You stole my son's childhood, but you did not take his soul. That survived, that endured, and it will outlive you." Daniel stood beside her, his hand gripping hers, his own statement read aloud by the prosecutor. "Every day for 25 years I died a little. Now I must learn to live again." As Hale was led away in shackles, Ethan sat in the back row, his face unreadable. He did not cry, nor did he smile. He simply exhaled, as though a weight he had carried since childhood had finally shifted, even if it had not lifted completely. The trial was over, but the work of rebuilding a life had only just begun. The verdict closed a chapter, but it did not erase the scars. For Ethan, life after the trial was not a triumphant return. It was a fragile attempt to learn who he was beyond the name Daniel Ward and the boy once known as Ethan Cole. The reunion with his family was complicated, layered with love, grief, and the disorienting gulf of lost decades. When Ethan first visited Laura at her care facility, she did not recognize him. She smiled faintly, calling him a kind young man, before drifting into silence. Minutes later, a flicker passed through her eyes. She reached for his hand, whispering, "Ethan." He nodded, tears slipping down his face. "Yes, Mom, I'm here." For her, the moment came and went, like sunlight breaking through clouds. Bright, brief, unforgettable. For him, it was a lifeline he had feared he would never hold again. Daniel, his father, struggled differently. Their first embrace was stiff, both men unsure how to bridge the gulf between them. Daniel apologized over and over. "I should have protected you. I should have found you." Ethan shook his head. "It wasn't your fault." In time, their conversations deepened. They talked about fishing trips they had once planned, about the sound of the paperboy's bike that morning, about how both of them had survived in their own ways. Their bond was fragile, but it was real, rebuilt not on memories of the past, but on a mutual will to endure the present. Reintegration was not seamless. Ethan carried habits shaped by captivity. Hesitation when asked personal questions, unease. In crowded rooms, difficulty trusting laughter that felt too free. He attended therapy, where he spoke of the years in silence, the rules he had been forced to obey, the identity drilled into him until even he doubted his own memories. "I lived as someone else," he said. "Now, I have to learn how to live as myself." Some days he introduced himself as Daniel, other days as Ethan. Both names belonged to him, and both carried pain. The community faced its own reckoning. Neighbors who had stapled posters to telephone poles welcomed him cautiously, unsure how to treat the man before them. Old classmates, now grown with families of their own, wrote letters recalling the boy who had once read The Hobbit at recess, the boy who planted sunflowers in his yard. For them, the return was bittersweet, joy shadowed by the realization that innocence once lost could never be fully restored. In quiet moments, Ethan returned to his childhood room, preserved all those years by his mother. The glow-in-the-dark stars still clung to the ceiling. The stuffed bear still sat on the bed. He lay there once, staring upward, whispering lines from The Hobbit the way he had as a child. The room smelled faintly of dust and detergent, yet beneath, it lingered the ghost of pancakes, crayons, and summer air. "I'm home," he said softly, though he knew home would never mean quite the same thing again. The epilogue of this story is not neat. Trauma does not resolve like a courtroom drama, nor does healing follow the rhythm of verdicts and headlines. For Ethan, survival was victory, but survival carried its own weight. For Laura and Daniel, the return of their son was a miracle, woven with grief. They had been robbed of birthdays, of graduations, of laughter echoing through their home. Those years would never be given back, yet they chose to honor what remained. On June 13, 2022, 1 year after Hale's sentencing, the Coles held a small gathering at their old house on Maplewood Lane. 47 neighbors who had once searched the streets in 1995 returned, candles in hand. At 2:53 p.m., the exact minute Ethan vanished from the school camera, they lit the flames together. But this time, the candles were not only for mourning, they were for survival, for the improbable reunion of a family fractured but not destroyed. As the light flickered in the window, Ethan stood between his parents. Laura's frail hand rested on his arm, Daniel's eyes fixed on the flame. For the first time in decades, silence felt different. It was no longer an enemy. It was peace, The story of Ethan Cole is not only about disappearance, but about the endurance of hope. It is about the failures of a system, the cruelty of one man, and the resilience of a child who grew into an adult, despite it all. Most of all, it is about the truth that surfaced when chance, technology, and memory finally converged. Some ghosts return not to haunt, but to rest. And on that summer evening, as the candles burned in the window of the Cole home, one ghost finally did.